my great pleasure today to welcome Caroline Uggla as our speaker. Now, as those of you that have been here any length of time at all will know, Caroline is one of our own, so she's been here 4 years now? Five years now. So Caroline hails from Sweden, in fact. Actually, they don't really do very much biological anthropology in Sweden, so she actually did her undergraduate degree at Durham, which has a cross-disciplinary anthropology degree, a little bit like our own. And then after that, she came to UCL originally as a master's and did our MRes, and then went straight on from that to work on a PhD with me. And rather than sort of telling shit, her PhD actually covered just, I'm not going to do too much what it was about, other than this is the title here, the Evolutionary Ecology of Health-Related Behaviours. Caroline will go into it. But she did a little bit of work on some African data sets, which I gather she's not going to talk to you about today. And in the second half of her PhD has been working on a great big data set from Northern Ireland. So if you are suffer from data envy, you might get a little bit irritated with her, because I think one of her sample sizes went up to about 1.8 million, I think it was, which is more or less the entire population of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland happens to have very good demographic records, which Caroline has made good use of to study the evolutionary ecology of health-related behaviour. So let's pass you over to Caroline.
Thank you, Ruth. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you, Kit, for inviting me from all the way across the hallway. So as Ruth mentioned, I'll talk about stuff I've done for my PhD for the past 3-4 years or so. And I'll be talking about health-related behaviors. So we all want to be healthy, and ideally we all want to be healthy without having to do anything about it, really, don't we? But we all know that it requires some sort of effort if we want to increase our chances of living a long and healthy life, right? And this effort can take different forms in terms of different types of health-related behaviors. So they might be preventative, such as perhaps going to the gym or keeping a healthy diet. Or they might be curative, so complying with medication or going and seeing your GP if you have a problem of some sort. And regardless of which, they might be things you actively do, so acts of commission, or they might be things that you abstain from, so not smoking or not drinking and things like that. That is harmful to your health. But we all know that probably most of us will find it easier to slip into the pub or the cinema than to go to the gym. We often find it easier to do things that have immediate gratification rather than delayed returns, right? So most of you probably recognize the scenario where you packed your gym bag, but you ended up just leaving it in the office, or you told yourself you shouldn't have that third piece of cake, but you ended up doing so anyway, or told yourself you shouldn't drink too much. And we see that this tendency affects population health greatly. So both in the developed and the developing world, most causes of death come from preventable behaviors. Today I'll be focusing on the developed world and specifically Northern Ireland, as Ruth mentioned, but we see these problems in the developing world as well, with HIV, malaria, and all these things that possibly could be mitigated by behavior change. What is interesting, though, is that there's great variation in health-related behaviors. So while some people never set foot in a gym, some people run marathons all around the world and crazy things like that. So this variation is really puzzling because we don't understand it very well. We know that there is some pattern with socioeconomic position, for example, but even so, we don't know exactly why that is. And there are many factors that aren't explored as much. So within public health, there's been a lot of different explanations trying to understand this variation, because of course it's very important if we want to increase population or improve population health and understand why is it that people systematically act in ways that is harmful to their health, right? So the first set of explanations pertain to knowledge. And the argument goes something like, is it the case that people don't invest in their health because they don't know the relationship between the behaviors that they engage in and the impact on their health? So if people only had this knowledge, perhaps they would change their behaviors and behave in ways that benefited their health. So in the EU, for example, there's been a law enforcing that we should have information on cigarette packets. So smoking kills. Also, by law, we have to have information saying that alcohol is dangerous in alcohol advertising. But what smoking has declined a little bit, but that seems to be, most people seem to think that that's because of the smoking ban rather than disinformation. Also in this country, about 10 years ago, there was a massive public health campaign informing us about the benefits of eating more vegetables, the 5 a day, decreasing sugar and salt intake, for example. But that also didn't lead to great behavior change, except for the most educated part of the population, that perhaps there were the ones that weren't so much at risk to begin with, or not at least the ones that were at most risk. And then a nice case study comes from New York City, where they enforced laws about calorie counting on fast food chain restaurants. So in all fast food chains, there had to be a count of calories on the menus. And the idea there was, if people know the amount of calories in the foods that they're ordering, maybe they'll make healthier choices. But this didn't seem to be the case either. So this is just one of these studies evaluating this quite nice case study, showing that in New York City and in similar areas in Newark, there were quite slight changes, if any, in these different subgroups of the type of food choices that people made. In some cases, people actually even ordered more high-calorie foods once they noticed these, or once there were calorie labeling. And we know that people noticed them because the studies took that into account. So on this background, it seems like if you want people to change their behavior, it's quite an ineffective strategy to tell people what to do, right? Probably, if you had to bet your money, if some public health consultancy firm came and asked you, don't tell them to just what to do. So is it high cost? So it might be the case that a healthy lifestyle is more costly to maintain. Gym memberships, healthy diets, for example, might cost more money. And that might constrain some people. This also doesn't seem very convincing when we take into account the fact that even health behaviors that are free or almost free, such as doing some sort of physical exercise outdoors, are actually less practiced by people of low socioeconomic position. And health behaviors that actually have a financial cost, such as sort of alcohol and smoking, are often more commonly exercised by people with low access to resources. But despite this, governments often try to sort of change VITs and taxes on things that are considered harmful, and that might be effective, for example, on a minimum price of alcohol per unit. And in Denmark, they've gone even further, and they have a butter tax, or a tax on saturated fats. But it's a bit unclear what the outcome here has been, and I like the subtitle, we don't know. Because it seems like people are switching to things that are also other types of fats that aren't good for you either. So this is a debate that's currently going on in public health. But it seems then that cost might be part of the explanation, just like some information probably is important, but not the full picture. And then we have a third set of explanations that relates to access to these foods. Portion sizes have increased greatly in the past decades. We all have access to high-calorie foods. But it seems to be the case that, we all have access to these things, but all of us aren't obese, and we could all possibly exercise, but even so, we don't often, probably as much as we think we should. So whilst these factors, like the smoking ban, for example, might have some impact, it seems unlikely to be the full explanation. There might be some underlying thing that we're missing here about why people don't invest in their health. And as you are in a Bayan seminar, I hope that you're not surprised when I say this. So natural selection has shaped human behavior to maximize inclusive fitness, not to maximize human health or longevity or well-being at any one point. And this is the fundamental contribution of evolutionary theory to public health, and really important. So when we think that people are behaving irrationally because they don't invest in their health, this is sort of thinking wrongly that we should maximize our health. In some cases, it might be good to do that, but not necessarily all the time. So, life history theory is the theoretical framework that I'm using for these studies. It's by no means the only perspective you can take to understanding health from an evolutionary perspective. Evolutionary psychologists might emphasize the mismatch argument, like Gert talked about a few weeks ago. Cultural evolution, people might talk about social norms of health behaviors, which probably are really important as well. But here I'll take a life history approach. And you're probably all familiar with it, so I'll just go through the basic principles and how it relates to health effort. So life history theory is a set of principles that concerns the optimal allocation of resources across the life course. And it's built around the principle of allocation that one unit of effort or energy that you generate to one fitness-generating function cannot also be allocated to something else at the same time. So individuals have to make trade-offs. And they have to make these trade-offs on one hand between somatic investment in their growth or bodily maintenance, or to reproductive investment, so mating or parenting effort. And depending on what kind of environment you're in, we expect different types of allocations to do things. Would be optimal, right? And maximize the number of genes in future generations. So if you're in a harsh ecology with high mortality, high risk, and probably high morbidity, it might be better, or it should be better, to speed up growth and reproduction, have quantity instead of quality in offspring, and also to favor behaviors that are more present-orientated, so more risk-taking, because if you put a lot of effort in things, investing in things that might gain you in the future or far off, that might not be so wise because you might not live to see that future, right? Okay, so you might have guessed then, if health behavior is some sort of effort and we cannot allocate it to different functions at the same time, then we can see health behaviors as a life history trade-off. We can conceptualize it as investment in your somatic bodily capital of some sort. And this means then that individuals who have a faster life history strategy, we would expect them to invest less in health and more to reproductive activities. And although life history theory was applied to health quite early on, for example by Kim Hill in the early 90s, there hasn't been very much research looking at health behaviors explicitly as a life history trade-off. And this is puzzling because there are lots of possibilities that open up when we look at health. So for example, we can use large databases that have been collected for other purposes than primarily understanding human behavior, right? So we can use these databases, censuses that I'll talk about here, or other large-scale databases. And this is in contrast to traditional life history studies that often have looked at traditional populations, small-scale populations with data collected over long periods of time by field anthropologists. And this is, of course, incredibly important because we can measure the costs and benefits of that particular social ecology and understand more about variation in human behavior. But what this perspective can add is that with the large sample sizes that we have, it enables us to look at how, for example, individuals manage trade-offs differently. And if you have small sample sizes, that might not always be possible in a community where you don't have some of that variation that you will have in very large countries or data sets. And it's important to emphasize that, of course, these trade-offs and health behaviors, we don't expect them to be conscious, these decisions to be made consciously. I think it's especially important to emphasize this when we're talking about health behaviors, because people tend to think that these are decisions that we make cognitively, right? But if we see it as a life history trade-off, that's not a requirement. So just to bear that in mind, that we expect natural selection to have acted on whatever mechanisms that are involved to have some sort of optimal health effort. Okay, so we can add health behavior to this somatic investment side. Okay, so don't worry so much about the sort of specific shape here of these distributions, but this is just a schematic representation to show you that at any point, one time in any type of environment, an individual will have some sort of optimal allocation to health. And that should be shifted by these type of factors. So depending on the state of the individual and the environment she's in, it might be beneficial to invest more or less in health. And so far, these type of variables have been looked at mostly. So there's a fairly large literature looking at mortality rates on life history strategies, so mostly other types of traits like reproductive traits. And then within public health, there's a massive literature on socioeconomic position and health behavior. And also a little bit now, from an evolutionary perspective, why people with low socioeconomic status would invest less in health, by people like Daniel Nettle and Gillian Pepper and so on. But rarely have these other factors also been taken into account, and importantly, rarely have people looked at these factors in the combination and how they affect each other. So an overall question that we can pose from this then is, can the variation in health-related behaviors be explained by the differences that different individuals have in anticipated fit returns from investing in health? So the structure of this talk, the first part of the talk I'll talk about an analysis on mating and parenting status and how that is associated with health effort. Then I'll move on to talking about ecological effects, so the environment an individual finds herself in, and also here health effort. Both these two parts will concern preventable mortality. And then lastly, I'll look at ecological effects on early birth. And early birth is, of course, a life history trait, but a very early birth can also incur health costs. So it's often conceptualized as a health issue. But we're interested in it for these two reasons, actually. Okay. So if we start with a basic premise that individuals should be willing to engage in behaviors that incur a health cost, as long as that health cost is outweighed by the fitness benefits that they gain from that behavior, then we would expect that single individuals should be quite willing to take health risks, right? So imagine a weird Bloomsbury population where the only place you can find a mate is the post-seminar drinks. That's the only where people find a mate. And every time you go, you have to have 5 pints because someone tells you to. And probably then your life expectancy is going to go down, right? Probably this is not going to be very good for your health, but you'll out-reproduce everyone who doesn't go to the post-seminar drink, right? And this is, of course, a silly and extreme example, but around the world in different populations, men who engage in risk-taking behaviors that has some quite, severe consequences on their, them being alive or not, can sometimes have higher fitness. So Yanomamo men, for example, but there's lots of examples. Okay, so that's the basic premise. But then once you found a mate, the benefits from engaging in those behaviors will decline, right? So then you should invest more in your own health. And especially this is the case when you have an offspring. Because when you have an offspring, a human offspring, that requires a lot of your investment, you being alive would benefit them. And this can be thought of as a sort of flip side of parental investments. So there's a massive literature on parental investment, but less so about how individuals invest in their own health once they have a child. And you might think that anecdotally you might have heard people say, oh yeah, now that I have a kid, I would never do this and that. Before I had a kid, I would go bungee jumping, I would do all those things. So we might think that there's something there, but we haven't really tested that quantitatively. We know, however, that there is a shift across the life course in mating and parenting efforts. So for example, testosterone declines in men when they have a baby and when they spend a lot of time with offspring. And we see this from a range of different populations. And it seems to be the case that you have a lower level of testosterone when you're investing more in your kid. And testosterone is, of course, the sex hormone that is sort of correlated to muscle strength and risk-taking behavior and these things. But then we also expect sex-specific predictions. So if you haven't guessed, this little illustration is to say that anisogamy, the fact that females produce large costly ova and then cheap sperm, and then in mammals, of course, females have the main cost of reproduction as they are the ones who have internal gestation and lactation. We expect men to compete for women. So men have more to gain from investing lots in mating effort, because potentially their reproductive success, their RS, can increase a lot, whereas a woman can only have a baby a year, regardless. But we don't really know if this translates into differences in health and mating effort. So these two simple predictions are this then. Single individuals, and particularly single men, should invest less in health, have lower levels of health effort. And individuals with dependent children, and particularly women with offspring, should have higher levels of health investment. Okay, but there is a fair amount of evidence in public health that we can make use of. So here, mostly we have mortality data. There's, of course, also data on actual health behaviors, but mortality data is useful for several reasons. And one of it is that often you have them on a population-wide level. Mortality as an outcome is also good because it's unambiguous, right? Someone is dead or they aren't. When you ask people about their health behaviors, they might lie, they might not remember so well about how much vegetables they actually eat, whatever. And mortality also ceases all fitness generating activities, right? So it's important for that reason. And it applies to everyone in the population. So that's very useful. Men and women and people of different kinds of activities, everyone is at risk of death. And you can die from different things, so we can analyze different outcomes of death. And that's very useful, as I'll tell you in a little bit. So from these public health databases, mostly based on developed countries and censuses, we know that men and non-married individuals have higher risk of overall mortality. So, and some specific mortality outcomes, for example, that women without children, the studies from Norway, have higher risk of alcohol-related death. So you might say, okay, why not just do a method review, go and see what everyone else has found? That's difficult because it's quite difficult to draw conclusions on the basis of the current literature. And that's because age ranges, socioeconomic controls vary a lot, and also few compare men and women, and that's one of the objectives here. Also, few people use cohabiting status and use marital status instead. And also, most studies look at parity, so the number of children someone has had or the number of children that they have alive, rather than if someone is depending on your care at the moment, which should probably be a better measure of you investing in your own health. And also, there's a lack of comparing preventable outcomes. So, of course, there are many merits using mortality outcomes, but there are also some difficulties if they're too broad. We want something that is closely linked to behavior so we can interpret what's going on. So to fill these gaps in literature, I conducted an analysis, and this was published in EHB in the summer, so you can go read it if you want. And this is based on the Northern Ireland mortality study. So, as Ruth mentioned, this is a great database not because there's anything particular about Northern Ireland, more than that they have this great data, and they're a small country. So they also have a large absolute number of individuals in their longitudinal study in a way that wouldn't be feasible in England, for example. And I'll talk about that in the third part of the talk. But here, you have 1.6 million people, everyone who was alive in Northern Ireland in 2001, and their census information, and then followed until 2009. And to analyze this data, since it is sensitive, you have to go to Belfast, you have to go to a little room where you're not allowed your mobile phone, you can only take notes on yellow paper, you more or less have to be escorted to the kitchen, but you have great people there helping you, and it is very secure because we're dealing with sensitive information. So also you have very detailed causes of death. So causes of death in Northern Ireland are recorded by your GP. And we know what people die from down to like the level of a tea towel. So quite a lot of old people slip in a tea towel if they have accidents in their homes. We know that. If they're in a car accident, we know if you crash with a tree or a lorry, and you know very specific types of cancers and these kind of things. And this is, of course, incredibly useful because we can then divide things into things that are roughly within your own control, that is preventable, that natural selection can act on, your individual behavior, and things that are roughly beyond your control, so more sort of extrinsic mortality. Okay? And of those things that are preventable, accidents, suicides, and alcohol-related death, and other preventable diseases are three outcomes that I analyze here separately. And of other preventable diseases, lung cancer, closely related to smoking, is the largest individual cause there. But it consists of a lot of different preventable diseases. And this is based on a definition used in public health and used by the ONS. And of course, it's not perfect, but it's much better than what has been used before. And we have data on partnership and living arrangements, and we have data on socioeconomic measures, how many cars you have, your housing tenure, education, and a range of other demographic variables. And we're interested in people roughly adult and reproductive age, so we analyze everyone between 16 and 59 and run Cox regressions to look at the association of death and mating and parenting status. So roughly, just some overall summary statistic is then that about 50% of all deaths are preventable. People with low socioeconomic position have high risk of death, not very surprising. It's also not very surprising that men have high risk of death. What is slightly surprising is the large sample sizes. So controlling for everything else, men have 70% higher risk of accidental death, which is quite a lot. Also 55% higher risk of alcohol-related death, and also higher risk of death from other preventable diseases. So this is likely to reflect differences in behavior and not be because men are more medically susceptible to these type of diseases, for example. Okay, but what about mating and parenting status? So I'm just going to show you these tables, but I'll just tell you what the results were so you don't have to worry about this. And these are hazard ratios if you do want to worry about it, where a number over 1 implies a higher risk. So this is controlling for everything else, and looking at these outcomes separately, we can first look here at men. So single men have higher risks of accidental death and alcohol-related death. There's no difference if they're living with someone or not. For children, men without children have high risks of alcohol-related death, but not the other two causes of death. For women, it's a bit different. So here, if you're a woman, it doesn't matter if you're living with someone. What does matter is if you have children or not. So women without children have much higher risks of all these outcomes compared to women with children. And this, again, is controlling for socioeconomic status and all these things that might confound these relationships. And I should say that this is based on that the effect of women was starker for children is based on interaction models that I'm not showing here, but this effect was larger than the effect for men. Okay, so far this seems to be in line with our predictions. Men have less health effort, partnership matters more for men, and children more for women. But we see some differences between these outcomes, and also this is something based on traditional parent investment theory, right? So that there is a gender-specific mating strategies. With these data, we can actually look at if that's true and look at subgroups of men and women and see if they vary. So when we did that, when we looked at if strategies are different for people with low and high socioeconomic status, this is what we find. So here, there's a larger difference, or there's a larger disadvantage of being single and not having children for men with low socioeconomic position, right? For women, it still doesn't matter if you're married or not, or if you're living with someone or not, regardless of socioeconomic position, but women with low socioeconomic position, with low access to resources, low levels of education, have higher risks of dying if they don't have a child. Okay, so we can update our sort of summary slide and say, okay, yes, our predictions still hold, but we also need to take this heterogeneity of effects into account. That trade-offs might differ, you might have different strategies depending on your mate quality, or that might be here a proxy by your level of resources. So just to sort of slightly summarize the first part of the talk here is that we can see that our predictions are largely confirmed, but this tells us also that the mating strategies are likely to be context dependent. They're likely to vary depending on your wealth, as we saw here. I should mention that there might be some causality issues involved here, because it might be the case, even though this is a longitudinal analysis, that people have a set life history trajectory quite early on. And that might mean that they might be less likely to form and maintain stable relationships, for example, but also more likely to engage in behaviors that leads to mortality. But this is an issue that most of these studies deal with, because very few studies can follow someone from birth until they die. So that's something that would be interesting, and that you could look at if you had data before and after someone enters a partnership, for example, within the same individual. And then, of course, mortality is a bit of an extreme outcome. I still think it's a really good outcome to use, and especially when you compare different outcomes like this. But it might be that women who are not cohabiting with someone might invest less in their health, not just to the extent that it leads to mortality. That's a possibility. Okay. Okay, so far I've talked about individual level differences. The next part of the talk will be about how individuals, all else equal, who find themselves in different types of ecologies might have different life history strategies and different levels of health effort. So probably most of you, this is your local ecology, I would guess, London. We know there's a great variation within London, right? In terms of life expectancy, in terms of mortality and things like that. But this is a topic, and we expect that individuals should be able to pick up on cues in their local environment and make different decisions based on that. And this is a topic that has received more attention within the life history theory. And we know that both within and between populations, mortality rates are correlated to life history trajectory and age of first birth and things like that. But it has been looked at more in terms of reproduction rather than health effort. And also, most studies have been based on quite high levels, so country level, for example, that doesn't really take into account what the individual encounters in her local surroundings. So one exception, of course, is the Wilson and Daly's famous study. Here, they looked at neighborhood differences. So they were able to find that in the Chicago neighborhoods that they analyzed, a high life expectancy at birth was correlated to lower levels of homicide. So where men were more likely to die early, regardless of homicide, they excluded that from the life expectancy, they were more likely to engage in behaviors that led to homicide. And this has been cited 400 times. It was great when it came. It was a contribution, because you can see that these predictions were held in a modern urban environment. One issue, though, that is inevitable when you're using aggregated data is that you don't know how the individual level variables play into this, and you don't know exactly what's causing this relationship. So as I showed you in part one of the talk, I mean, there is a lot of individual differences based on mating and parenting status, but also, of course, in individual socioeconomic position. So we need to control for individual level data. Then there's a set of research that's looked more at health effort. So Daniel Nettle, for example, has analyzed different Newcastle neighborhoods and been able to sort of underpin what public health people know, that in areas with low socioeconomic position, people seem to invest less in health. But this study was a great contribution because he looked at observable health behaviors. So not just outcomes, this is actually what's going on in these neighborhoods. But then, of course, there's just 2 neighborhoods. So we don't know if this is the same all throughout different neighborhoods. And also, we don't know what it is about these neighborhoods with higher deprivation that makes people invest less in health. And this is important because deprivation is great if you want to understand something overall, but if you want to know what's actually causing these behaviors, you have to try to tease those factors apart. So one of the central tenets of life history strategy is extrinsic mortality rate. So the idea that we're in environments where your risk of dying from things beyond your own control is higher, you should have a faster life history strategy and then invest less in health. And Daniel Netto has modeled this and found that actually if people who live in areas with high extrinsic mortality rate have lower fitness benefits from investing in health. They should invest things in other causes. So this seems to make sense, but we don't know very much about how actual extrinsic mortality rates affect behavior. So there's some psychological studies and some experimental studies by Gillian Pepper, for example, that has shown that your own perceived risk is correlated to a higher perceived extrinsic mortality risk is correlated to lower levels of health effort on a scale of 0 to 100. But we want to look at how this affects actual life history traits in the real world. We also want to know about factors other than mortality, because in the Western world and in a country like the UK, there's more variation in morbidity than in mortality. We have healthcare, we have all these things that makes mortality that perhaps doesn't vary as much. Also, there might be other factors like crime, for example, that are easier to detect than mortality rates. Okay, to complicate matters further, this is something that you might want to include. So the adult sex ratio, the proportion of males to females of reproductive age. So the idea here, as I mentioned in the first part of the talk, is that males generally perhaps compete for females. But if sex ratios are skewed, so imagine the reverse here, maybe it's the case that females have to compete for males. And potentially this has some impact on health. So maybe when you have higher competition, you would have higher health risks because you might engage in behaviors that are detrimental to your health but might give you some reproductive benefits. This has recently been reformulated, so it might be the opposite. It might be that more males might lead to less violence, actually, if they have a mate, and they might do mate guarding instead. We won't go into this too much. You can ask me more in the questions if you want. But just a second thing to mention here is that regardless of when competition arises, this competition might not necessarily be violent. So rich men, for example, might compete with resources rather than violent behavior, as you perhaps saw in the first part of the talk. So this is an area that's lacking both theory and empirical evidence, and it's great that we can at least ask questions about how adult sex ratio relates to these preventable mortality outcomes with this data set. Okay. And just to mention that, of course, there's a whole parallel massive literature in public health about area effects on health. And it's important because it might affect implications or sort of interventions and policy that we form in getting people to invest more in their health. But here again, they tend to use measures that are quite broad, so area quality, deprivation, or focus more on proximate mechanisms, sort of distance to healthcare center and things like that. So it's not that they go out and ask questions about sex ratio that we'd like to do. And then again, there's also sort of methodological questions. I mean, there's some mixed result with how much they actually affect health. Generally, effects are quite small. Doesn't mean that they're not important, but we have to take that into account. And also, perhaps there's heterogeneity of effects. So it might be that not every individual in an area is affected by in the same way by the ecological cues that they're experiencing. Okay. So these are our predictions. We expect that a high extrinsic mortality rate, a high morbidity rate, and a high crime rate will lead to lower levels of health effort, and possibly lower levels of health effort in behavior in the mate-limited sex. But this is more an exploratory thing. But we know that there are strong relationships with individual socioeconomic position and mating and parenting status. So possibly none of these things matter once you controlled for the individual characteristics. But you'll soon find out. So I've touched on most of these already, but these are some methodological challenges for the life history literature on area effects. So we need to include individual level data. We need to measure the local ecology, not too big, not too small, because if it's too small, we get unstable area rates. look at different methodological or different ecological measures to tease these effects apart, right? Deprivation doesn't really tell us very much about the driver of life history strategies. And very important, we need to use cause-specific mortality, especially when you're dealing with health behaviors, because otherwise you end up with a circularity issue where you expect the higher overall mortality lead to behaviors that lead to mortality that then leads to higher mortality. So we need to separate out those two. And we want to look at effects over time and compare both female and male behavior. So traditionally we've looked at female behavior when we've been interested in reproduction, and we've looked at male behavior when we have been interested in risk-taking behavior. But we want to compare the two when we can, as we can. So this is how the NIMS, the Northern Mortality Study, addresses these questions. So we do have local data on ward level, and we have these different measures, and we have extrinsic mortality, and both males and females. Okay, and this is more or less the same as part 1, but with the addition of the ward level variables. So in addition to the individual level variables, how much does ward level variables help explain health effort? And this is Northern Ireland, and it's 582 wards. I used a total 1.6 million to calculate ward level rates of extrinsic mortality, morbidity, the proportion of individuals who had a long-term illness or rated their health as poor, adult-sex ratio, fairly straightforward, and the crime rate, so based on a crime deprivation measure. Just a few more words about preventable extrinsic mortality rate. I mean, I've already mentioned what preventable mortality is, so unpreventable mortality is everything that's not within your own control. And it covers lots of different types of causes of death, and again, they're based on these ICD-10 codes. And of course, like no cause of death is entirely extrinsic, but it fits very well with this definition that's used in public health. So that's what we're using to predict how likely it is that you'll die from causes beyond your own control where you live. And this is what it looks like. So this is unpreventable mortality rate by 100,000 population. I should mention also this is based on individuals between 16 and 74, because after 74, it's thought that all causes of death are to some extent unavoidable. You can't do anything about it then. And this is morbidity. So you can see that it's not all in the same places that you have high morbidity and mortality. And that's interesting because then we can look at them separately. Okay, so I'll present the results, just the raw data first. So if we didn't have access to any individual data, what kind of conclusions might we draw? So this is showing you accidental suicide and alcohol-related death altogether. And here, it seems like our predictions are confirmed. So in areas with the highest mortality rates, causes of death from these preventable causes of death are highest. Same in morbidity areas and high crime rate areas. And here there's some slight negative relationship with adult sex ratio. So here, where there are most men, and here, where there are most women, men seem a little bit more likely to engage in risky behaviors. So that's actually the opposite to what we might have thought based on the Trigger's model. And this is the same but for other preventable diseases. And it's the same type of relationships, just that rates are a bit higher. Okay, so rather than asking what of these factors have a significant effect on health, we might ask which combination of these factors best predict preventable mortality. So we do that from a model selection procedure where we say any of these models might be the best model to predict death, and we evaluate that with an AIC value. And the individual model controls for all these things that I mentioned before. So what's the answer? So for women, it seems to be the case that the individual model is the best with 53% probability. For men, on the other hand, the model with extrinsic mortality and crime rate, or one with just individual and mortality, are the best models. And this is for younger men and for the sort of more risky immediate causes of death. If we move on to other preventable diseases that are more perhaps long-term causes or long-term health neglect, it's the same again for women. The individual model is the best, but for men, it's a model that includes both who you are and your characteristics, but also you have higher risks if you live in a high extrinsic mortality rate area. Okay. So, but then we might ask, is it the same for all individuals, or does it vary with socioeconomic position? So looking at the risky death for young men, seems to be the case that this is a hazard ratio then, so the risk of death is highest for the low SEP men, but these men, and it's highest in the highest mortality areas, you probably can see, but the difference here is bigger, so you have a double disadvantage if you're both poor and you live in a high mortality area, compared to the difference here for people with high socioeconomic position. So it seems you also have to consider people within areas differently and see how they're affected by these factors, or what kind of associations there are. Okay, so to recap, it seems the high extrinsic mortality rate is a predictor of preventable mortality for young men, and crime rate as well, but that individual characteristics were a better explanation for female death. Although there was some sort of tentative evidence for when women were mate limited, they had higher risky death, but not the best model. And sex ratio didn't make it any of the best models for men, so that might not affect their health behavior. Okay. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing, but look at age at first birth, and I'll go through it quite quickly. But age at first birth has been looked at a little bit more, and it is a health issue, and it's also a life history trait. And across countries, same here, you know, higher life expectancy is associated with a higher age at first birth. But there's lots of variation within countries, which you can capture with these type of analyses, and there are also lots of variation based on individual characteristics like father absence and stress and physiological development. So you have benefits and costs of delaying childbirth, and we expect them to be balanced at some point. And the cost of delay might be that you run higher risk of mortality and morbidity if you delay birth, and you get perhaps less help from your kin if they're also more likely to be ill if you start later. But then sex ratios also come into it, because if there are few mates around, it might be beneficial for you to start reproducing once you see that you have an investing partner. It might also go the other way, as this study found, if you might delay childbearing anyway. So if you live in a less deprived area, a sex ratio might have a different effect. But it's just important to know that it might affect these things. Okay, and then of course the benefits of delaying. So you have less health risks, both for the mother and the child, if you delay it a little bit. Of course they then become higher if you delay for too long, but that's not what we're talking about here. And there might be huge benefits to delaying because you can accumulate resources. So here we are in higher education, and it's quite difficult to raise a child and get extrasomatic investment at the same time. So you might sort of wait, and it might gain the offspring and offspring quality to delay a bit and accumulate resources. And we've seen also then that female income also affects these cross-country patterns. Okay, so same predictions. I won't go into them again, but the only thing I'll say is here we would expect a female biased sex ratio to be associated with higher female birth rates. So when females have to look for a mate, they might try to reproduce earlier. But this should be the same for men if females are the one who decide or have the most sort of decision power in when to get pregnant and give birth. Okay. And now, okay, this is based on the Northern Ireland longitudinal study, so it's 28% of the population, and we have data on birth for individuals who were between 6 and 14 at the census, because we knew they didn't have any births before that. So they're between 14 and 23 when they reproduce in our sample. And same, we have really good socioeconomic variables, house value, family structure, and other things. And house value correlated with morbidity, so again, we had to remove morbidity from these analyses. Okay, and again, our predictions are confirmed by the raw data. You recognize these associations now. I can point out that then, yes, where there are more females and males, but I'm not showing here, but the relationships are the same, are more likely to reproduce. And for the individual characteristics, these factors accelerate first birth. So living with no parent or a single parent, a low house value, well, delays birth actually, and high deprivation, so low house value accelerates birth, and education deprivation and urban residence accelerates this as well. So over and above these quite strong effects of house value, you see, like, you know, they have 75% higher risks if they live there, and even higher if they have a house of £200,000, are there effects of where you live. And you might recall that for the preventable mortality, individual model was the best for women, but models with extrinsic mortality and crime were the best for men. Any guesses as to what we might find here? Okay, I'll just show it. So here the picture is a bit different. So here we see that for women, several factors come into account or come into play. So it might be that the full model is the best, or one with extrinsic mortality and sex ratio did quite well, but certainly different factors play a part. For men, on the other hand, it's mostly crime and mortality. So you might remember that was more or less the same as we saw with preventable mortality, which is interesting. And then this is just briefly to show you, because we can, you know, when you think about something for a very long time, you can become very interested in, like, so what is the effect of wealth here, and how much are the ecological effects attenuated when you control for individual wealth? So even when you control for other individual factors, but not wealth, these are the white dots. But then when you control for house value, effects decrease, right? So it's really important to say, okay, we might assume something about these effects, and they might look much bigger if we don't control for house value, obviously, but it's just to show you that. Okay, so our predictions, again, they were higher extrinsic mortality rate mattered, especially for women, but also for men. Crime rate mattered for men, and a female by a sex ratio was associated with earlier reproduction for women. Okay, so you can say a few things about these results. I've said some of those things already. That ecological effects do seem to affect age of first birth, but they're attenuated by wealth. So they're smaller when you control for individual wealth. Also, they vary for men and women seem to be the ones who drive the sex ratio effect. In this analysis, I couldn't test for differences with socioeconomic position because there were so few people with high socioeconomic positions who gave birth before the age of 24. And something interesting that I didn't show you here was that I also tested with total mortality rate, right? But that didn't have an effect. So it seems to be the case that it's the extrinsic mortality rate rather than the total mortality rate, which correlates more with socioeconomic position, that is associated with age of first birth. And then we might ask if these conditions or if these effects remain when you look at childbearing at older ages. And they might or might not, but that's something we could discuss. Okay. So you can ask some more broader questions about these analyses. I'm coming to wrapping up here soon. So it can be difficult to tease apart individual and ecological effects even when you have the data. So it might not be that they theoretically are different things. So something like house value, for example, will be a little bit of an individual measure, but also a bit of an area measure, because you would have certain houses in certain areas. And there were some effects like, you know, morbidity and wealth were very strongly correlated. So being ill is being poor, and being poor is often being ill. And then you might ask broader questions about health behavior then. Is it that some people who are ill, for example, have a difference in their immediate returns from investment? So we have the assumption here that some individuals will have greater returns in the future, or everyone will have the same returns in the future, but only some people will benefit from, because they'll be around in the future. But if you're poor and none of your friends invest that much in health, you might not get sort of the social norms from that. We'll come to you in a bit. But it might also be that you don't feel as great when you try to invest in health because you have sort of more disadvantages to deal with, or more stress from other factors. We also want to ask things like if these ecological measures map onto real conditions, right? So is it the case that if you ask people in certain areas about the sex ratios, can they accurately say that, yeah, here there seems to be a bit of a shortage of men, don't you think? You know, or is it something that is driven by something else? So we'd like to know what people in these areas perceive their environment. Some of the studies looking at age of first birth and mortality have found that life expectancy then is a poor predictor of age of first birth in contexts where mortality is high. And this is likely to do with the fact that mortality is not at equilibrium. So it's changed a lot recently, and then we cannot expect behavior to be adapted, because there might be a bit of a time lag. But in Northern Ireland, conditions aren't as extreme as in Sub-Saharan Africa. There's no AIDS epidemic, for example, and this might be one of the reasons for why we see a pattern like this here. And then we can ask questions about the first part of the talk. I mean, is there really a trade-off between somatic investment and mating effort? Isn't it the case that if you invest in your bodily health, that's also sort of more likely to get you a mate? Like, when do our assumptions hold up? But we can discuss that. But we did see some quite strong effects of partnerships. So at least for some part of the population. And then something that I haven't addressed here is, of course, there might be social norms to health behaviors. So that might become attached from the local costs and benefits that you have. And that might relate to some of these things, but it's likely to influence health behaviors as well. But it's the holy grail in someone. Maybe we can try to figure it out soon. Okay, so just very briefly to sort of say something about the benefits of these different approaches to one another. So I hope that I've shown you here that you can use life history theory to test specific predictions of health. And they're theory-driven. That's really important, because in public health you might not necessarily have very strong predictions for why individuals might behave in certain ways, or why different types of individuals in areas and with different characteristics might behave as they do, and to not see that as irrational behavior. From health research, there's lots of benefits that goes into life history theory that I've sort of used here. So I've used this new measure, or a new way of conceptualizing extrinsic mortality, which is some sort of development that is really important, that it would be hard to do without these really big data sets collected by someone else. And we can also test the trade-offs, the difference in the trade-offs. And we can use the different types of behaviors, the different types of outcomes that would also be quite costly for an anthropologist in the field to collect themselves. And something that I haven't mentioned here, but that Ruth alluded to in her intro, was that I've also done an analysis on parental investment in child health. And this is a contribution to evolutionary theory, because often parental investment literature is concerned with child outcomes. It's very hard to get good data on what parents actually do for their children. But when you look at health behaviors sort of vaccination or treating their kid for diarrhea, that's actually actual parental investment that directly benefits the child. So that's also something that is beneficial. And then, of course, there are mutual benefits here. So there's an increased use of secondary data within human behavioral ecology. It needs more work, so you need to read up on all the public health literature, which is massive. But there are also really real benefits to doing that, because you have to understand what's going on and what other people might be doing. And hopefully, public health can be influenced by some of these findings. And I believe that you can use these predictions to understand why people behave as they do, and then you can improve health behaviors. So I'll end there and thank all these people and the funders. Thank you very much.